do hope that I will speak at a speed which is acceptable and reasonable, even though that is extremely hard for me. I wanted to talk tonight about a topic which I've always found fascinating and which I think should be made into a film, actually, because the scenario would be absolutely amazing. And this is a story which is worthy of the most adventurous spy novel. I want to talk to you about Stuxnet. And first of all, I want to set the scene. You can see my first slide on the screen. I'm going to talk, first of all, about the context of Stuxnet, which is basically that of the deterrent system which was put in place by the nuclear powers after World War II. Then I'm going to move on slightly to talk about the geopolitical dilemma that the West found itself in somewhere around the turn of the century, with the rise of Iran and the Iranian efforts to acquire military nuclear technology. Then I'll talk to you about the slightly more technical side of this speech, and I will endeavor to go slowly. And I hope you'll be using your glossary. I'll be talking about the way in which Natanz, which is the prime Iranian site for uranium enrichment, how it actually goes about enriching uranium. Then we'll actually get on to the heart of the matter, which is Stuxnet itself, which I'm sure you've worked out by now is a computer worm, which was created somewhere around 2004, 2005, 2006, no one knows quite, and then used to damage the Iranian nuclear program. And then I'll talk at the end, if there's time, which I'm sure there won't be, about the future and whether Stuxnet was useful, whether it's set the Iranian nuclear program back or not, and what the future holds for us. So to move back to the first item on my little slide, deterrence. Now, as you know, once the Germans and Americans and Brits managed to dominate and master the technology of the nuclear bomb during the Second World War, basically, and once the two bombs were launched on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world woke up to the fact that the nuclear weapons are something which should never be employed because they're too awful. And so after many years of thought and negotiation, the major Western powers came up with the concept of mutually assured destruction, the acronym being MAD, which is very apposite because it is a fairly mad concept. The idea being, of course, that if you can guarantee to your potential adversary that in the event of an attack using nuclear weapons, you would respond in such a massive fashion that both parties will be destroyed, there you have mutually assured destruction, which means that for any rational actor launching a nuclear attack, a preemptive nuclear attack, that is a first strike, would not be a logical or rational thing to do because it would bring about the destruction of the country which had launched the attack. Now, the problem with this is that there's a basic flaw. It relies on the fact that all the actors concerned are logical and rational. You might well say, for example, that the current tenant of the White House is neither logical nor rational. And it came to the notice of the West around the year 2000 that the Iranians were making massive efforts to acquire the technology to create nuclear weapons. Now, what happened then, of course, was that basically the entire world community, perhaps Russia accepted, felt that this would be a complete nightmare. It is not possible to have a regime like the successive Iranian regimes becoming a nuclear power. And the Israelis, of course, who were the first ones to have reason to fear the rise of Iran, the Israelis had to be held back, because had they not been held back by other Western powers, they in their turn would have launched a preemptive strike against the growing Iranian nuclear enrichment capabilities to make sure that the Iranians never got the bomb. But that would not have been wise, because that would have involved tactical nuclear weapons being used by the Israelis. And had that happened, that would have been pretty much World War III. So other Western powers like Germany and the USA, they thought, well, if we can provide a reasonable alternative to bombing the hell out of Natanz, then maybe we can stave off World War III. And that's what I thought. I put some pictures on the screen for you to show you. The Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, the current President Rouhani, and the President who was the one who used the phrase pushing Israel into the sea, President Ahmadinejad. And if you can manage to pronounce his name first time, you're doing well, because it took me quite a long time to work it out. So these were the players, and the Americans basically decided they needed to find a solution. Now, let me now move back to my first slide to talk to you about Natanz, the centrifuge cascades, and uranium-235. You may or may not know that uranium is an ore. It can be dug out of the ground like iron. Now, the thing is, most of the uranium ore which exists in the world is uranium-238. That's the isotope of uranium that you find in a natural state. And basically, it's contained in uranium oxide. That is what you find in the ground. Now, if you want to make a nuclear bomb, you can't use uranium-238 because it's too stable, and you can't initiate nuclear fission easily with uranium-238. So what you need to do is refine it and enrich it and make it into the much rarer isotope, uranium-235. Now, you may or may not know how this is brought about. What you do, it's actually quite simple. You take a whole load of uranium-238, you add to it hydrofluoric acid, and that creates a gas. It doesn't happen, it's fairly hard, you have to go through all sorts of processes, but basically, in summary, in a nutshell, you add hydrofluoric acid to uranium-238 ore, and this creates a gas, the gas being uranium hexafluoride. Now, once you've got the gas, you can start to do something with it. So what the nuclear enrichment plants do is use centrifuges. I have a picture of some centrifuges here, I believe. I should have anyway, so look, these are centrifuges. On the left of the slide here, you have massive cascades of centrifuges which work in tandem, one after the other. So what happens is a very slow process, and because uranium-235 is lighter than uranium-238, when you whiz the gas around at massive speeds, and we're talking here about more or less 100,000 revolutions per minute, 100,000 RPM, that's the speed at which the centrifuges will turn, then it throws the heavier uranium-238 atoms to the outside, and what remains in the middle is the lighter part of the uranium, which is uranium-235. So if you keep doing this from one centrifuge to the next, you can see in the array on the left here, there are hundreds of them, you end up with something which can be used in a nuclear weapon, uranium-235 in a concentrated form. So to back up a bit, let me have a look at my slides. Where was I? Yes, so here we have the Natanz nuclear fuel enrichment plant. Now, there are no photographs of the inside of that Natanz because it's extraordinarily heavily guarded, and it's all underground. So this is basically all we have. We have satellite photographs. What I didn't say to you was that there was another option open to the West, possibly, rather than using Israeli tactical nuclear weapons, which was a no-no, was not really a proper option. It was the option of using the American bunker buster bombs. Now, American bunker busters are massive, massive traditional, conventional explosive bombs, which can, as the name implies, bust a bunker. And they thought they could possibly have used some buster bunkers to get to the underground facilities at Natanz. But it then turned out that the facilities were so heavily armored, they were surrounded with tens of meters of concrete. I have a picture here of, this is an artist's impression of Natanz at the inside of the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant. So it's many, many meters underground. It's extremely reinforced, and even the American bunker busters would not have done the job. So the Americans thought, basically the Americans and the Israelis, what else can we do? So what they did was decide to create a computer worm, which is Stuxnet, and the computer worm, its job was to be introduced into the control systems of the centrifuges. I should open a parenthesis here to say that the control systems are SCADAs, S-C-A-D-As, which, as you can see from your glossary, are supervisory control and data acquisition systems. And these are computer control systems which enable you to create graphic interfaces and manage a device like a centrifuge. And so Stuxnet was a very, very advanced and complex computer worm, which took 2 or 3 years to write. which would be injected into the control systems of the centrifuges. The control systems would then no longer manage the speed at which centrifuges revolved, which meant that they would spin much faster than they were designed to, and then they would explode, basically. In the same way that if you get a car, if you go and get your parents' car, preferably not your own, and you put it in neutral, you turn the engine on, and you put your foot flat on the accelerator, most cars will end up blowing up because the engine will no longer be controlled. There's nothing to hold it back. It's in neutral, and the engine will get faster and faster, and basically it will blow itself up. And this is what Stuxnet did to the Iranian centrifuges. Now, the clever thing about it was that no one knew what was happening, because part of the subtlety of Stuxnet was that all the control computers were given wrong messages by the worm, so they all thought they were doing the right thing. And that meant that the operators in the Natanz plant didn't realize what was going on until it was too late. And even then, they didn't know why the centrifuges overspeeded. That's the term used. They were overspeeding. I should point out that centrifuges themselves are quite complex machines to put together. There aren't many companies that can do them properly because they have to be very light and very strong. The rotors inside which turn have to be very made of very noble metals and very well balanced, and not many companies can balance them that well. Then of course, and also you need bearings which are have to be so resistant to the very high speed at which the centrifuges turn that the best solution is not to actually use a physical bearing, but to use a magnetic bearing. So there's no actual contact between metal, which means that the centrifuges can turn extremely fast. Let me open a second parenthesis, because I'm a car man, as you know, and I talked about the centrifuges turning at around 100,000 revolutions per minute. That's roughly the speed at which a turbo will turn in an automotive engine. They also revolve at around 100,000 RPM. Now, to come back to Stuxnet, the project to put Stuxnet together was dubbed Operation Olympic Games, and it was begun under George W. Bush, and then continued under Obama. Neither the Israelis nor the Americans ever actually admitted to actually being behind Stuxnet, but it has become fairly clear that they were. There's a company which you may have heard of called Kaspersky Lab, which is a highly skilled information development company with a lot of computer coders, and they've been looking into it and trying to identify the origin of Stuxnet. We're almost at the end now because I've spoken for 13 minutes already. Just let me talk about the end then. How did they introduce Stuxnet into the centrifuges? They did it actually not by trying to approach the nuclear plant, because you can't get into Natanz. It's very heavily guarded. It's also air-gapped. Air-gapping, as you know, means that there's no contact with the outside world, and certainly no contact with internet. So you couldn't introduce the worm through internet. So what they did, they used a Trojan horse system, what they call an unwitting Trojan horse, that is a Trojan horse that doesn't know it's a Trojan horse, by injecting the code, the Stuxnet code, into the control systems which were created by the makers of the centrifuges. And then when these makers, primarily American companies, I beg your pardon, German companies, brought their equipment into Natanz, they brought with them, inside the equipment, the computer worm, which was dormant until it found the relevant control systems which it could then attack. These control systems, as I say, being of this SCADA variety, and they are called PLCs, Programmable Logic Controllers. Okay, so I had to come to my Shakespeare slide now, because first of all, the future, what does the future hold? Well, the thing is that Stuxnet set back the Iranian program by somewhere around 10 years, because they had to get new centrifuges, they had to rebuild the ones that have been destroyed, find new suppliers. And that's of course is not easy, because there are all sorts of sanctions, and not many companies are allowed, well, no one's allowed to, by the West, to provide nuclear technology to Iran. So it's very hard for them to get hold of this technology. So that means they lost about 10 years of their nuclear program. But the current situation is that they've more or less made good all the damage that was done by Stuxnet. And we think, generally speaking now, that Iran is not far from having the ability to create nuclear weapons, maybe only a matter of months away. The fact that the JCPOA, the joint, what's the word, comprehensive plan of action, which was the agreement put together between a lot of Western states and Iran. The fact that the USA pulled out of that, God help us, because of President Trump, really didn't help to manage Iran's nuclear ambition. So the situation now is that we are very concerned again that Iran is on the verge of having nuclear weapons. Now, what Israel will do about that is a matter for debate. Whether or not they'll try and create a second Stuxnet is another matter as well. Otherwise, we're going to end up with this. And you will no doubt see that I've put on it the strap line from the film Dr. Strangelove, how I learned to stop worrying and love the bomb. But I don't think that that's something which is an option. So I now come back to my last slide, which of course is Shakespeare, because it has to be Shakespeare. So what we've done, I think, using Stuxnet vis-a-vis the Iranian nuclear program is what Macbeth did when he murdered his best friend Banquo, but he didn't manage to murder Banquo's son. So what he said was, we have scotched the snake, not killed it. I.e., the snake is still alive, we've damaged it, but it's going to come back and bite us later. So that, I think, is the situation we're in now vis-a-vis the Iranian military nuclear program. I won't quote the whole thing because Julio told me I couldn't, or you'd all hate me. And so even more than you do already. So there we have it. I hope you found that interesting. I'm sorry I spoke for 16 minutes. It was a bit too much. I will stop now and go away, I promise. Bye-bye.